Canada has a history of missing its climate targets. The Trudeau government is signaling it wants to change that with its pick for Environment Minister. Former activist Stephen Guilbeault is now leading the file, a choice that is being seen as polarizing. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says the appointment is very problematic and warns about job losses. So what does Minister Guilbeault have to say about all of this? He's in Ottawa. Minister Guilbeault, before you ran for office, you spent your life as a climate activist fighting against pipeline projects. Are you going to be taking that? Are you going to be that same activist now that you're the Environment Minister?
I'm very proud of what I did as an environmental activist, and I think it's important in our society, and we've seen it on all sorts of social and environmental agenda for civil society to be keeping government's feet to the fire. And I think that's exactly what activism is doing here and elsewhere around the world, which allows us as government to be more ambitious when it comes to specifically the fight against climate change. And I think one thing we've heard very clearly coming out of the last federal election is that Canadians from coast to coast to coast want governments, all level of governments, certainly including the federal government, to do more and to do it faster when it comes to fighting climate change.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney says, from his perspective, that your appointment sends a problematic message to Alberta, and he is worried that you will, quote, bring in a radical agenda that would lead to mass unemployment. What do you say to that?
I would respond that Canadians have defined what the agenda is. And they said they wanted more fight against climate change. They wanted less pollution. They wanted more clean technologies, more public transit, more protection of nature. So the agenda is pretty clear. We have a plan that's been presented to all Canadians, an enhanced climate plan that was presented last December. We toppled that with investment, very important, historic investment in the green recovery in the 2021 budget. And on top of that, we have taken more commitments during the campaign on climate change. So our plan is very clear, and Canadians know about it.
When he accuses you of wanting to bring in a radical agenda that could lead to mass unemployment, what that term mass unemployment, do you dispute that? Do you reject that? What do you say to that?
It's interesting that Premier Kenney would take that line. If we were to ask people, where do you think there's the most renewable energy development happening in the country? Some would probably say Quebec, others maybe Ontario or British Columbia. Actually, it's Alberta. This is the place in the country where there's the most renewable energy development. So the transformation of the energy sector is happening across the country. It's happening across the world, but it's certainly already happening in Alberta. So this idea that fighting climate change is going to be bad for business and bad for jobs is simply not being supported with what's happening in Canada and specifically what's happening in Alberta.
In 2018, the Liberal government bought the Trans Mountain pipeline and is in the process of twinning that pipeline. You spent your career as an activist standing against pipeline projects. Now that you're in a position around the cabinet table to have influence over that kind of a project, is your government going to continue ahead as planned with the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion?
What I've said on TMX was that I wasn't there to rewrite history. The pipeline was bought before I came into politics. That's what I'm doing now with my cabinet colleagues, with the rest of my government, and frankly, most of the political parties present at the House of Commons, is to find ways where we can accelerate the fight against climate change. And we've made some pretty significant commitments during the last campaign, namely to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies 2 years earlier than our G20 partners. So the agreement at the G20 is to eliminate them by 2025. We've committed to do that by 2023. We've also committed to put a cap on the emissions of the oil and gas sector. And we're not doing that for any other sector in the Canadian economy. We're not doing that for steel or for the auto sector, for the forestry sector, cement. We're doing it for oil and gas. Why? Because it represents 25% of the emissions in Canada, and we decided we need to tackle that problem. So we've done a great number of things when it comes to fighting climate change. putting a price on pollution. For example, the IMF recently said that if all G20 countries did what Canada's doing when it comes to pricing pollution, the world would be 2/3 of the way to meeting the Paris Agreement targets that the countries took just a few years ago at the International Climate Change Paris Conference. So we are stepping up to the plate, but I'm the first one to recognize that we need to do more.
So you say that you're looking to find ways to accelerate your plan, and I respect that you were not at the cabinet table at that time that decision was made back in 2018. And you say you don't want to rewrite history, but this is your opportunity to have influence on something that's active right now. So do you not want to use your influence and look back to your activism background to say, that perhaps this is not a project that is in line with your plan to accelerate your goals?
I've used, and I'm using my activism background every day as a cabinet minister to ensure that we do more in carbon pricing. As you may recall, before the last climate plan was presented, carbon pricing was going up to was increasing by $10 a year up to 2022. We've taken the very courageous decision, and even Greenpeace said that it was an ambitious decision to continue increasing carbon pricing, not by $10 a year, but $15 a year, going all the way to 2030. Canada already has one of the most ambitious pricing scheme in the world. And by 2030, it may not be the most ambitious, but it will certainly be one of the most ambitious. We're the G7 country that has been investing the most in the green recovery, second in the G20. So we are taking very significant step in the fight against climate change.
Do you support your government's efforts to fight the state of Michigan in court to keep Enbridge's Line 5 still operational?
I think Line 5 is a very different subject, and this is an existing pipeline that provides all sorts of services to Eastern Canada. So this says, obviously, we're not talking about increasing fossil fuel production here. We're not talking about investment in new fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think it's important to make the distinction between that and other projects.
So do you support the government's effort to fight the state of Michigan to keep that pipeline going?
Of course I do. I mean, when talking about the fight against climate change, one important thing that we need to keep in mind is this needs to be a transition. This can't happen overnight. In my own province of Quebec, we consume about 360,000 barrels of oil a year. So even if we were to shut down that pipeline, well, guess what? I mean, we would still be consuming 360,000 barrels of oil a year in Quebec, which would need to come from somewhere. Now, obviously, my role as environment and climate change minister, is to ensure that working with Quebec and other provinces, we reduce that amount of oil consumption every year in provinces and overall in Canada. But it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
You're heading to COP26 this weekend with the Prime Minister. There's this thing called the Climate Action Tracker. It's an independent science-based partnership, and it says that Canada it still falls short of its target. It says Canada needs a 54% domestic reduction in terms of its drop in its carbon emissions to be Paris compatible. When you go to the world stage, you're the brand new environment minister. How are you going to defend Canada's record on climate change?
Well, I will defend it by showing all the progress we've made. We've increased our target on climate change twice in the last year. And a number of experts are now saying that, so our current target is to reduce those emissions between 40 and 45% by 2030. And a number of experts have said that between what we've already presented, so the elements of our climate change plan, the platform commitments, Canada is on the way to meeting its target. And do we need to do more? Absolutely. And I think that as we continue deploying our climate change plan, we will see that maybe we can go for an even more aggressive target. But let's focus on implementation, because we've played in that movie so many times in Canada of having debates over debates about targets, but never about implementation. We need to get this job done. And as we do that, then just like we did, we came in 2015, we still had the Stephen Harper targets, and we said, well, let's focus on implementation, and then we can see what we can do about targets. And that's exactly what we did. We worked on implementation, and we said, well, part of the plan is in place, so let's go for more aggressive targets. And we've increased those targets, as I said, twice in the last year. So let's continue working on implementation. And 2 years, 3 years down the road, in fact, in Glasgow at the Climate Change Conference, countries will be discussing and hopefully agreeing that the world needs to, by 2025, come back with new and more ambitious targets. So let's get down to business with implementation, and then we can talk about even more aggressive targets for Canada and for the world.
So you're opening the door to increasing those targets for now?
Well, the negotiations in Glasgow are about that, not for tomorrow morning, but for 2025, yes.
All right, Minister Guilbeault, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.